Okay, everybody remember the terrible movie, The Breakup with Vince Vaughn and, okay. Does everybody remember the scene where she's like yelling at him because he's not doing the dishes? Yes. And the line that she says is, he's like, nobody likes doing the dishes, right? And she was like, I want you to want to do the dishes. And he's like, nobody wants to do the dishes. Nobody likes doing the dishes, right? That's intrinsic. Okay, right? So it's this idea that she really wanted him to be intrinsically motivated to do the dishes. And his answer was, nobody is intrinsically motivated to do the dishes. So this is where from inside, I do things because I just want to do it. I just want to do it. Do you believe that? Do you do things just because you want to do it? Give me an example, because I bet I can prove to you it's extrinsically motivated. Eating cupcakes, still extrinsically motivated because that's a sweet treat and it's reinforcing.
Even
Food is
reinforcing. You're doing that because maybe you have guests.
Right. Guests coming over, or you need it to be clean to reduce your stress. Or if I don't have a clean dish in the house, there's nowhere for me to put new food. So like I need a clean dish to put new food.
So it's reinforcing, it's not intrinsic.
Correct.
So like hugging the baby. It's like,
Right. There's a Friends example too, where when I like to just talk about Friends a lot, but Joey and Phoebe are arguing about like, they tell Phoebe, right, there's no good deed that you do because you actually do it to help somebody else, but rather because it makes you feel good. So even doing good deeds is selfish, is kind of the justification there. This goes along that same line, right? Because if you do something nice for somebody else, it makes you feel good, which reinforces you to do it again in the future. Okay, so all that to say, there is no such thing as intrinsic motivation. All of our behavior is externally reinforced. Could be a physiological response, like when you're hugging a baby, right? Some people don't like hugging babies. They terrify them. That'd be my brother-in-law. He refused to hold any of my children until they were like 10. None of them are 10 yet. I'm exaggerating. So 2. Right. So little Johnny should want to do math. I shouldn't have to bribe him. They should just want to learn. The other issue with this becomes if somebody doesn't want to do something, then we call them, right? Does that word? Yeah, it makes me mad. I don't like that word. So I think everyone should just do it because it's intrinsically motivated. You should just do it because you're a part of this classroom. You should just clean the house because you're a part of this family. I'm going to need something more than that. Okay. But ultimately, the argument for intrinsic motivation is a fundamental misunderstanding of what reinforcement is. So typically it is something that happens outside of us that makes our behavior continue. So ultimately unless there is lots of reinforcement happening outside of you for doing a certain behavior, you will never develop that feel-good feeling you get for doing it.
They don't have ADHD, but in some ways
Everybody has ADHD.
I feel like
Hence my job.
A lot of things I am not. I thought I was supposed to be intrinsically motivated, and I feel like I beat myself up because I'm like, I just don't want to do it, and it's really hard to make myself do stuff, especially when there's no. Even though like there is a reward for like getting good grades, but I don't I just can't motivate myself to study as hard as I should, even though the motivation should be getting a good grade.
Oh man, I could go on for days about the underdiagnosis of ADHD.
Yeah, I took that one.
I mean, especially in women, because
Who undiagnosed and who like, I would fix that, so.
Mhm. And then hyperactivity can include, the frequent thoughts where your brain is racing. And if you go into a mental health provider as a woman and you say you have racing thoughts, they'll diagnose you with bipolar.
Yeah.
But if a guy does it and it actually is bipolar, they'll get diagnosed with ADHD. So y'all aren't any better off with it. So, yours will just flip the opposite way. Mhm. But it's the same symptoms. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Spence.
How would you explain, personal pleasures as far as anything moving?
Oh, so it's still, so the automatic reinforcement is it has the feel good feeling. And so like you wouldn't do it if it didn't feel good.
Yeah, that was part of my question.
So like when you're doodling in class or when you're like creating art.
Sometimes it's like part of it. Like you have moments where you don't want to show but you're always creating art, like doodling and creating art is something.
Right.
But I don't know.
I meant it in the sense of like doodling while you're in class and your brain is elsewhere and you're doing it as a way to fidget versus like actively setting your mind to it. So I think that is that you're intermittently reinforced for the behavior. So you don't have to be, remember I said, you don't have to be reinforced every time you do something. And if you think about doodling in class, oftentimes doodling in class might help you focus better. So you're going to retain the information better without having to put forth as much brain power. And so therefore that becomes reinforcing because, yeah.
I got smoking cigarettes for things that are addictive.
Mhm.
But things like, what's part of it? You don't have.
Yeah, but that can still release dopamine. Or maybe not dopamine. That brings me to my Legally Blonde context where she's like happy endorphins.
Right.
So like you work out and it gives you endorphins. Endorphins make you happy. Happy people don't kill your spouse. So it's the same idea that most behaviors like that will still trigger a brain response with dopamine or serotonin or things like that. And that's what's reinforcing. It's still not intrinsic, even though that's happening inside your brain. It's still not like I'm doing it just because I feel like doing it. Nobody does anything just because they feel like doing it. And you could even argue with like playing the guitar. Is somebody listening to you? Are you getting attention for that? Maybe you're not. Maybe you just like the way it sounds and it's a calming activity for you and it brings your heart rate down. There's lots of different aspects to that. And it could be all of those things at different times. And so in certain situations, you play the guitar to get attention. And in certain situations, you play the guitar to relax.
Right.
And it kind of depends on what else is going on. So you can engage in the same behavior to get different reinforcers. All right. So.
Like,
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yes, this is B.F. Skinner. But he said we're automatically reinforced apart from any particular deprivation or like removal of something when we successfully control the physical world. So what that's telling you, right? So if you think about like control freak people and they want it to be a certain way, that level of control, Ava, is still automatically reinforcing. So the argument is, even though nobody else gave me that reinforcer, it's considered automatic reinforcement, but there's still some level of like change within me that makes me feel better. And that is what's reinforcing. Does that make sense? So it's not just because you felt like doing it. So he's saying like, Look, I don't know. I was gonna bullshit some answer. I can't, guys. Not today. Not today. Let's just like dot, we'll add an ellipses there, dot. We are automatically reinforced when we successfully control the physical world. Don't worry about the rest of it. Yeah. See? Yeah, look, who cares? Don't hang up on those words, Bree. It doesn't matter. But successful action, playing the guitar, can be its own reward. This isn't like going against the idea of reinforcement because you still have like changed the environment in some way. So now you're playing a guitar. It's nice to listen to music, right? It all interacts together. So automatic reinforcement is anything that you are personally, like inside of you, reinforced by engaging in the behavior. So back to that friend's analogy, right? By doing a good deed, it makes you feel good. Snuggling a baby might make you feel good or terrified on some people, but playing the guitar, it makes you feel good. This is different from socially mediated reinforcement. So that's where somebody else gives you access to the thing. They're giving you attention. They're handing you your paycheck. They're giving you a cupcake, whatever. It's different, but it's not necessarily this intrinsic motivation, but rather the behavior that we're doing helps us meet that need. So even the like, nobody likes doing the dishes. Maybe there's a few people who do. But doing the dishes then creates a clean environment, and having that clean environment maybe reduces your anxiety, right? Or maybe that's just me. I don't know. But can you guys think, we all kind of came up with like positive reinforcement. Well, I actually gave you a negative reinforcement example. Can you tell me which one of the examples is a negative reinforcement example? All of the things. Positive or negative. I can add something or I can take something away. No, just from now. I literally just said it. Doing the dishes would be negative reinforcement for me personally, because it's going to reduce the anxiety of the stress. Because, you know, like if you're ever in a dirty place, right, or if you're in an overwhelming place, if I go clean it up, then it's not as overwhelming and overstimulating. And now my anxiety has decreased. And that would be negative reinforcement.
You know how you go like get up and make the baby, but that can be like,
It's not intrinsically motivated.
so like you're automatic.
So with making your bed every morning, at some point you were probably reinforced for doing that. You don't have to have reinforcement every time for it to be reinforcing. Because then what happens on the day you don't make your bed? So it's negatively reinforcing. It's how many of you have to wait till the thing beeps at you in your car before you put your seatbelt on? You're beating the beep, right? I'm putting my seatbelt on so I don't even have to listen to the beep. I'm making my bed so I don't even have to be anxious about the fact that my house is messy. So you're avoiding it entirely. So technically you're still reinforced almost every time. Yeah. Any positive reinforcement examples? No. Intrinsic. Automatic reinforcement that's positive reinforcement. Yeah, can't be from somebody else. Yeah, well, could I argue that's negatively reinforced because I'm removing the hunger cue? Ooh. Huh? Yeah, buying yourself something nice. What did you say? Yeah. You can argue both. It's the same thing with the ticket. Yeah, you can argue it both ways because I'm giving myself food. All right. Anything else?
Worrying myself for waking up early.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Always. All right. Other ones, those habits, thumb sucking, Would this be negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement? Why? That's the behavior. Why are you engaging in film sucking? What happens after you start sucking your thumb? Typically, you do. Seth,
Could this mean taking away boredom as well?
boredom or anxiety. Yeah, it's removing. So negative reinforcement. Scratching, negative reinforcement, because once I scratch, hopefully it doesn't itch anymore. Whistling, positive reinforcement. Putting money in a drink machine, positive reinforcement because you get the Coke. It's like buying yourself Starbucks. Drinking water from a fountain. We don't do that after COVID. Don't do this. No, bad. You fill it up. You fill up your water bottle at the drink fountain. You don't drink it directly from the fountain. Yes, negative because you're getting rid of your thirst. Yep. You got it. All right, so let's get a little more technical. We're going to add a lot of vocabulary today. You're going to love it. So we're going to have a 2-term contingency. Eventually we'll evolve this into a 3-term contingency, but our response or our behavior is putting money into the vending machine and pressing a button. And then this SR plus stands for a stimulus that's reinforcing in the positive way. So positive reinforcement. Snack is delivered. So we are more likely to put money into a vending machine and it maintains and increases over time. But what happens when the vending machine doesn't give you anything because it's broken? No, it's actually because it's intermittent reinforcement. It's actually really strong. So you'll kick it and try to get anything to get that snack out, and your behavior will go through that extinction birth process really fast. Huh? In the future, you'd still probably do it because unless like you would have to go a lot of times with the machine being broken. And it might be that specific machine over there in the psychology auditorium is always broken. So I'm not going to even bother walking over there. Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's all, I mean, they're always broken. Okay, but this is referred to as the reinforcer. All right. So what about things that happen before we engage in the behavior? So we're going to talk about the antecedent. This is just a fancy word of saying the thing that happens immediately before the behavior occurs. Okay, so first caveat. Certain components of the environment let us know when reinforcement or punishment is available, right? So I'm going to speed all day long, and then the second I see a police car, I now know I need to slam on the brakes. Or there may be certain parts of town that they always are. Like on Getwell in the church parking lots after you cross state line in Mississippi. Twice. Okay. Years apart. You would think I would have learned, but I didn't. Because it was intermittent punishment and not every time. But certain components of the environment will let us know when reinforcement is available. Like I'm not going to just walk around with my dollar out to put in a vending machine unless I actually see the vending machine. So there are things that have to be there for us to know that this behavior is going to get us reinforcement. The antecedent matters, and our behavior does not increase in every situation. So think about it. I'm not necessarily going to get, well, I might get Starbucks every time I see a Starbucks just because I always need coffee, but I'm not going to necessarily go get lunch every time I drive past a fast food restaurant because I might not be hungry, right? So antecedent variables, we then call them discriminative stimuli, or SDs. That just tells us that our body, our brain can discriminate when reinforcement is and is not available. So it is something, a stimuli, something in the environment that lets us discriminate when reinforcement is available. So SD. All right. So we're going to talk more about antecedent variables later, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. But the response is more likely to occur in the future in the presence of an SD. Okay. So now we've taken our two-term contingency and made it a three-term, the A, B, C's of behavior. Antecedent, behavior, consequence. All right. So SD antecedent. Handle on faucet marked with blue dot or the letter C for cold water. Response is to turn the handle with the blue dot or the C, and then cold water is presented. So maybe it's to fill up our water bottle, right? Turning the handle marked with the blue dot or C occurs more often in the future because we've been reinforced. You ever been to a faucet where the water got hooked up backwards?
Yes.
And doesn't that mess with your brain? Right? Because you're like, I turned the blue handle or the handle that says C on it or whatever that indicates it's supposed to be the cold water, and it gave me hot water. That messes with you a little bit. And here's why, because you've been reinforced so many times that when it's backwards, you're like, this is not great. But it doesn't mean that maybe the next time you go to that specific sink, you'll know the difference and you'll flip-flop it. But generally speaking, every time you go to a new sink, you're not going to flip-flop it, right? You're still going to assume that the C is cold on any new faucet you've ever encountered. All right. So a person says, hi, how's your weekend? To another pleasant person, and a friendly conversation ensues. In this example, what is the SD? It might be easier if you tell me what the behavior is first. Sometimes easier if you work from the middle and then out. So what happens? But what's the behavior in this scenario?
Hi, how are you?
Hi, how was your weekend? Absolutely, that's the behavior. Saying hi, how was your weekend? All right, so what's the SD for saying hi, how was your weekend? The pleasant person. And then what's the consequence? The friendly conversation.
Why is it SD in the beginning?
It's all stimuli and discriminative stimuli, and then the S for. So I told you guys at the beginning, they make up silly things with silly words for the rest of us to know. I don't know, some old guys back in the 1960s thought that this was going to be a really great way. Yeah. It's the stimuli is discriminative, and it's a stimuli that's reinforcing positively. So it's all about the stimuli and what the stimuli is doing. So is it either before it happens and it would give us a D, a discriminative stimulus, or it'd be an R or a P that would tell us that it was reinforcing or punishing afterwards. So it's actually that it's all about the stimulus. That's why the S comes first. Stimulus is something in our environment. Could be a behavior. So like in conversation, an SD to say the next thing in the conversation. So like you ask me a question, that's an SD to me to answer the question. If I answer the question and I say something and you have something else to say, my statement becomes an SD for you to say something else. It's too complicated. Okay. All right. So like if you write out a whole conversation, it's like, hey, you know, and that's person one. And person two says, hey, back. Yeah. Yo. Well, yeah, we'll keep it short because I'm just like trying to make it. Yo. And person one says, what's up? Yeah. And person two says,
None.
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 And person and then also says you. Yeah. None, you. And then person one says and then person two says
Bet.
Cool. Yeah, I got it. It's like my C got a little crazy. All right, so seeing person two, like person one, like, looks at person two. So sees person two. And that seeing a person two is the SD for person one saying, hey. The consequence for this person saying, hey, is this person saying, yo. But now we gotta look at person two's consequences. Person two only said yo because the SD for them was hey. And then they said yo, that was their behavior, and it's reinforced by person one saying sup. And so essentially everything is an SD and a behavior and a consequence, depending on what the thing is in the chain. Now, does that make sense? So this is the SD for this. The consequence for, for this one's actually not a consequence yet. Yo is the consequence, so to there for that one, and then so on and so forth. So it gets complicated, but everything's an SD, a behavior, and a consequence until the conversation's done. And that's why when you argue with your teenager, it's a bad idea because you're actually reinforcing it. All right. So the person enters the office space and no one is there. Obviously, now some people might, but you're not going to walk into an empty office space and say, hi, how was your weekend? Why not? Because no one is there. Unless I want my coworkers to think I'm a little cuckoo. All right. Person sees an annoying person that's always bragging about himself. Person does not say, hi, how was your weekend? And I haven't shown you this, but this is actually a delta, not a triangle.
What?
A delta, like a Greek letter. Because we can't just keep it simple. All right, so an S delta would be a stimuli that would be punishing. So in this scenario, what's the indicator that punishment is available? Yeah, that person is annoying, yeah. And if I start a conversation with that person, then I'm gonna have to listen to them tell me about how awesome they are, and I really don't have time, energy, or care enough to do that right now. You've all been there. You've all been there. Don't laugh at me. Delta means. All right, second caveat. Reinforcement depends on motivation, not intrinsic. Motivation depends on motivation, okay? So how would we know if somebody was motivated to do something? Yeah, we're not going to, right? This is the idea of like, I love Chick-fil-A. I love Starbucks. But unless I'm hungry or thirsty or really need caffeine and it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm not going to stop and just like go get it, right? I also maybe don't have money in my checking account, so that would also be a motivating factor here too, right? So like at some point, that'll kick in. But I hope I'm not going to eat something because I'm not hungry. Though some people eat because they're bored, and that's a whole different thing. And but the SD will only signal the response if the individual is motivated to engage in the response. So think about, you can walk past your bed 1,000,000 times a day until you're like tired and ready to go to sleep. You're probably not going to just like go lay down in your bed, right? Now you're all in college, so you could probably take a nap at the drop of a hat. So, but you get the argument. So we would call these motivating operations, or MOs. So this alters the reinforcing effectiveness of a stimuli. So food is always reinforcing, but the more hungry I am, the more reinforcing that food item is. It also will alter the momentary frequency of responses reinforced by those stimuli. So I might be a little hungry, so I might have a smaller snack, right? And I might have a whole meal if I'm really hungry. And again, we're going to talk a lot more about motivating operations, because if you think that's confusing, we're going to split it into a different, like a whole lot of extra words. And you've probably seen them on your flashcards. Establishing operations, abolishing operations, things like that. They all kind of fit under this category. Okay. So now we've taken it from a 3-term contingency to technically a 4-term contingency. So that's because the MO essentially happens or is in the, a setting event, if you will, before the antecedent becomes present. So motivating operation, deprived of water for a long period of time. Now I'm much more likely to turn that water faucet or when I see the water faucet, I'm much more likely to turn it on and then get cold water. And now that behavior is even more likely to occur in the future when I've been deprived of water. Does that make sense? Yeah. Like you don't just walk past every sink and go, oh, you know what? I'm thirsty. Let me refill my water bottle, right? If my water bottle's full, there's no point in filling it up. So many different factors at play there. All right. So I don't really like wants and likes and stuff in ABA, but essentially when the person wants water, i.e. is thirsty, and then you're more likely to do what it takes to get yourself water. Spence.
How important is it to measure that in operations? And other than like survey question, how would you do it?
So if I am working, I'm going to do dog training. So that's easier. If I talk about kids, then people get mad. Yeah. So if I have just fed my dog a huge meal and then I want to use treats as a reinforcer. Now that's a terrible example because my dogs will eat treats no matter. Yeah. But that might be why they're overweight. So it is what it is. But in theory, they would be less motivated for the treats because they just finished the meal and they would be less hungry. Okay. But also their kibble is boring. But like if they got into the trash and found some steak scraps and they like binged on some stuff they weren't supposed to eat that was really interesting for them, and then I tried to use treats they'd be less motivated to do it. So you don't necessarily like measure it in this like concrete way of measurement other than they ate at 4 o'clock and it's 4:10. Food is not going to be reinforcing right now, but maybe at 4:30 or really at 5 o'clock, definitely at 7 o'clock. So like the farther away you get from that thing, the more likely it is. If I always reinforce you guys for raising your hands and communicating in class with like a Skittle, you would all satiate on Skittles and you get really bored of it by the end of the semester and you would never want to eat a Skittle again for a long time, right? So that kind of idea. It's not necessarily that you're measuring it. So you kind of just observe the environment. Let's see. Okay. Any other questions about that, Spence? All right. Do you have to know that you're being reinforced for it to work? No.
Like to do with the mental or the alcohol or whatever it was on the office.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you don't have to know. It's just happening. Are certain behaviors susceptible to reinforcement and others are not? Still no. All behaviors are able to be reinforced. The thing that matters is that like time and place of when reinforcement occurs following the behavior. So like we said before, that reinforcement needs to happen right after the behavior occurs or we'll get confused. And that's how all of your dogs have superstitious behaviors. Dogs are really bad at it. Also, like, ask me about training cats. Like in theory, this works for cats. I don't know, not mine. But that's because they're automatically reinforced for not following instructions. Yeah. That's all I got for that. They're just crazy. All right, but this is how we develop rule governed behavior. Anybody know somebody who's got like rules that they follow that may or may not make sense to you? Guess what? You all do. Everybody has a rule governed behavior. So this is like no immediate consequence tends to be apparent. We just do it because we need to do it. The response or consequence delays is greater than 30 seconds. And typically what you'll see is an increase in frequency of the behavior following one instance of reinforcement. So trying to think of an example. Some people are really good at not speeding. I am not one of those people. But some people are really good at that, and they can just get punished or reinforced for that one time, and they'll never do it again, right? And we would call that a rule governed behavior. From person to person, everybody has some rule governed behaviors or things that you do because you've only been reinforced for it one time. Oftentimes that goes hand in hand with autistic people. Autistic people are really prone to rule governed behavior and then expecting everybody else to follow their prescribed rules, which can be really challenging. And then these are the things that we talked about where no apparent consequence for the behavior exists, including no automatic reinforcement, but the rule does. But also I'd argue that there's some level of automatic reinforcement there too, because by following the rule, they've probably reduced the anxiety of what happens if we don't follow, right? So it's the same thing with making your bed every morning, Jazz. Same idea. Mm-hmm. Yes.
My 5-year-old goes to the bathroom. I try to teach him all the time like this because he's not verbal.
Mhm.
He does this weird thing where he's like, I can't do it. Things like, right?
Yeah,
And
because
he will not be, when he's all done, he'll do this, and he has to do that before he plugs his toilet. He cannot.
That is the prime example of a rule governed behavior.
Yeah, that's what I want to bring up.
Yeah.
Like, he does, and then he flushes his
Probably because
toilet.
one time you were like, that's so cute. And now he does it every time.
And
And
he'll
you're
sit
like,
there and wait for me to say okay after he claps.
yep.
Say okay, and then he'll flush. But if I stand there and don't say anything, he'll sit there with me be like.
All right. And now your turn for the
Right.
behavior change. And now I need you to do this next thing. Absolutely. That is a prime example of rule governed / rule
I
governed
did try
behavior.
to interrupt.
The chain once and it threw him off.
Oh
Sometimes it's not worth
You have to sit down and.
Yeah, sometimes it's just not worth fighting.
Yeah, I was like,
change.
whatever.
No. You got to be in the right mindset for that. But superstitious behavior is another one where you only have to be reinforced like one time and you're automatically, right? We talked about this with sports teams, right? You stepped out of the room and the other team scores a touchdown while you're out of the room. And you're like, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. And now you're like, exactly, at every game, and you haven't watched it since, because if you watch it, then that's going to ruin the, yeah. People do that with socks and jerseys. Like, people are weird. All people have weird behavior. But this is when reinforcement accidentally follows a behavior that did not produce the reinforcement. For whatever reason, dogs are really prone to this too. They're like really prone to superstitious behavior. But it's oftentimes we see it in sports or anything like that. I wouldn't call this necessarily like superstitious behavior, but a teacher consoling a child who hurt themselves may reinforce crying or hurting themselves in the future, right? Which is why if you are a parent and you have kids or you work with kids and they fall, you may go, oh, no, that's not it. That's not it. You just sit there and you wait. Okay, I'll console you now that you're crying, but I want you to be the one that decides if you're going to cry, not me being like, oh my gosh, you've fallen and hurt yourself. Hey, but, oh. Yes. Yes, that is it. That's it. That's the superstitious behavior. Now we think. But. Great.
like routine behaviors, like, you know, people who don't put up their Christmas tree over the exact day that they want to, and they like can't like get nice and really nervous, do you know what I mean?
Yes, yes, no, that's superstitious behavior.
You know, like last year, my family we did 2 fireworks, and my dad was like, no. Oh, it was like, I feel like I should be doing fireworks, so I don't.
That actually might be more of a group governed behavior. Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah. free, yeah.
So I don't know if it's like counts as well, but when my dog was alive, like every morning we had to say good morning to my grandmother. We had to go downstairs, he would open the door with his nose and he would jump up on her bed and be like, wake up. Like every morning.
That's a rule governed behavior.
That's rule
Yeah,
governed,
that's rule
okay.
governed. Because he was probably reinforced one time for it, and now he's like, and this is what we do every morning. Yeah, dogs, notorious. Superstitious behavior, rule governed behavior, absolutely. Jazz. And then just-
So, me and my friends, like, you know, I don't know if this is a rule governed, but like, you cannot skip the pole, like, when we're walking.
That's superstitious.
You cannot skip the pole, like, it was standing, and you go back around. And we do them far past, if you split it, like, you have to walk all the way.
Yes, superstitious. Jessica.
So this is like with my roommate's dog, he's precious, but he's so skittish about everything. And so when it was my birthday, my boyfriend had got me the giant, like, balloons or whatever.
Mhm.
And so they were in my room, he would just stare at them and be like, oh my gosh. And one day my boyfriend saw that he was doing that and decided to chase him. Oh, no. I was like, no, but then like literally he did not go near my room for like ever. And then my other roommate brought in the same balloons. And like he literally would not go in the same room with the balloons. And I'm like, I told my boyfriend, I was like, look what you did.
And we'll talk about that when we talk about punishment. 'Cause, yes, going near balloons was punishing for this dog. Poor dog. All right. For sake of time, let's stay on track. It is fun to talk about this. All right. So any automatic reinforcement occurs independent of another person delivering it. So it's all something that is either within your control or that you feel inside of you. So the response itself, engaging in that behavior, produces the reinforcement. So stretching, scratching an itch. This does not refer to behaviors that are automatic. So it's not like blinking that's reflexive or things like that, but rather that the consequences are delivered automatically. So, because blinking is actually a classical conditioning thing and not an operant conditioning thing. And so when we talk about it from an operant conditioning piece where the consequence encourages the behavior to continue in the future, that's what we're talking about here is being automatically reinforced. Impulsivity is a whole other thing, and we will talk about that on a whole other day. But that tends to be related to not pausing long enough to recognize what punishments are available for your behavior. It's typically what that is. Okay. All right. So we talked about this a little bit last time, right? But we're going to classify reinforcers by origin. So we have unconditioned reinforcers, right? Things we don't have to learn to be things that are reinforcing for us. So food, water, oxygen, warmth, sex, human touch, things like that. And then conditioned reinforcers or secondary or learned reinforcers are things that were neutral stimuli to begin with, right? You're not born thinking that money is this great thing that helps you buy all of these other things. So that is a secondary reinforcer or a generalized reinforcer. But we can also condition reinforcers through verbal conditioning. So this is like pairing it with praise. So I can teach you to like something by me praising you while we do it, right? Be a high five, things like that. Money, stickers, tokens, all of these are great ways to provide reinforcement when I can't immediately provide you with one of those other things. A token economy is great because like, I don't necessarily want to give you like a big reward every time you do something, but I can give you a placeholder reward. That way the reward is immediate. And I can say things like, here's this token, great job for sitting and paying attention. Here, great job for turning your homework in on time, all of these things. And so I'm pairing it, and the words that I pair it with are going to make it a little more reinforcing as well, so that that person knows exactly what it is that they did. And then the verbal praise is also reinforcing. So, all right. So generalized condition reinforcers are a condition reinforcer that you can essentially use to access any reinforcer that your heart's desire, pretty much, conditioned or unconditioned. It doesn't depend on a specific motivation to be effective, right? I mean, maybe a little bit, but I mean, you're still going to go to work because you need a paycheck. You may be more motivated to go to work when you have like $5 in your bank account versus when you have like $5 million in your bank account, right? But at the end of the day, we typically stay motivated for money just because it's always going to get us something else that we need. Social attention is another one that most people typically can always benefit from social attention. Now, introverts maybe want less or more of that at different points in time, but generally speaking, everybody likes social attention. All right. So we can also classify reinforcers by their formal properties. So we'd have edible reinforcers, so food, sensory reinforcers like jumping on a trampoline, getting tickled, things like that. Tangible reinforcers, trinkets, toys, activity reinforcers, so playing a game, recess. Social reinforcers, so physical proximity, social interaction, high fives, hugs, things like that. And this is essentially saying that items that function as reinforcers are idiosyncratic across people, so it's a little bit different from person to person. So everybody's going to want different things. Generally speaking, everybody likes 1 through 5, right? But like from those categories, what you individually like is going to be different from person to person. So I can't come in here and offer sour candy to everybody. Caitlin's not here today because Caitlin hates sour candy, but maybe today would have been a good day to offer sour candy because most of you like sour candy, I'm assuming, but that's not going to be reinforcing for everybody. Same with Skittles. Some people might not like Skittles. And then there's weird people out there who don't like chocolate. Anybody not like chocolate in this room? Oh, I was like, you only like dark chocolate? Okay, same, yeah. But you see how you guys are particular about what kind of chocolate you like. And some people in this room are like, I don't care. As long as it's chocolate, it doesn't matter to me what kind of chocolate. That's Brittany. Brittany's like, chocolate's chocolate, right?
No. I don't use specific gourmet taste now.
Got it. That's me with coffee. I'm not just going to drink any coffee. Yeah. It's gotta be good coffee. And chocolate and coffee, I think, are very similar in terms of that like flavor profile. You gotta be you can't just like any dark chocolate's not good. There's specific brands. Absolutely. Yeah. See, but it's idiosyncratic across people. We all have our weird preferences. So things we can do to figure out if things are reinforcing to somebody or do a stimulus preference assessment. So there are lots of ways to set that up. But essentially like pairing two things together and seeing which one they like better, putting a variety of options out and seeing which one they select each time. And then also like how long they sit and play with a toy. So how much time they spend on a task. And I can also do reinforcer assessments to kind of look at the same idea in terms of like, which things are reinforcing for you. All right. Recipes? Rest in peace. Oh, yes. I haven't updated this, but like, I love that. But Grandma's Law. Anybody, you guys read about this? Remember what Grandma's Law is? Premack principle is the fancy way to say this. You guys may not know it by name, but you've all experienced it. Has anybody ever been told, if you want dessert, you have to eat your vegetables first? Okay. If you want to go outside and play, you have to clean your room first. So it's essentially saying that in order for you to access your reward, here's what you have to do for me first. Okay. And we call that grandma's law, pre-med principle, mostly because grandmas are notorious for saying things like that. And then this is like being silly, right? Because vegetable eating is like a 3% probability behavior, but dessert eating is like a 46% probability behavior. So what this means is eating your vegetables for most people is a low probability thing. But eating desserts or sweets is a high probability behavior. So I'm going to ask you to engage in a low probability behavior before I allow you to do a high probability behavior. All right, some other caveats for preference or reinforcer assessments. You can do that today, but what you like today may be different from what you like tomorrow versus what you like next week versus what you like next year, so on and so forth. So you have to keep checking in on these things over time. Otherwise, you're like, hey, we keep giving Skittles, but their behavior's not changing. Why not? Well, maybe I don't like Skittles anymore because that's what you gave me for 100 sessions in a row. But it also preference assessments don't identify the reinforcing effects of a stimuli. So just because you prefer paper towels to hot air hand dryers in public restrooms doesn't mean you will like actively work to have access to paper towels in the bathroom. Call that bootleg reinforcement because I'm just do this instead, right? No, nobody else, you do it because also hot air hand dryers are disgusting and you should read up on that. Terrible. So you're still not going to go work for it, right? I'm like, I just won't dry my hands, right? I'm just going to shake them till they're dry them on my pants, go somewhere else. It'll be okay. So just because we prefer something doesn't mean we'll work to access it. All right. So 3 ways you can figure out what people like. You can ask them. Rocket science today. You can ask them. You can observe them. So a free operant would mean I just let you guys into a room with lots of really great things, and I just watched to see what you were drawn to. And then the presenting piece is where I'm like, here are 4 types of candy. Pick which one you want to eat. And then I'm gonna take that one out and you ate it. And now I got 3 pieces left. Now pick the next one you like. All right, now pick from those 2 that are left. And then I guess you can eat the last one if you want it. Or I could set it up where there's 4 types of candy and I keep replacing the candy that you take so that it's back in the mix each time. So lots of different ways. Lots more time to talk about preference assessments later, but typically when we want to know if something's rewarding, we ask, observe, or present. Okay. Now back on to reinforcement. We talked a lot about positive reinforcement. Okay. So what is positive reinforcement? Adding something to increase the future likelihood of behavior, right? So that's the key here. Future likelihood of behavior. So now that you know what positive reinforcement is, we're going to really drill hard with some negative reinforcement. Okay. So if positive reinforcement is we add something to increase behavior, negative reinforcement is to increase the future likelihood of behavior. Absolutely. And negative reinforcement is not. All right, here we go. Negative reinforcement, also sometimes referred to as escape or avoidance. So you will engage in some response to end an ongoing aversive event, a fire alarm. You're going to step outside. You're going to leave it alone, right? What are some other examples of escape maintain behaviors? That could be avoidance too, right? So it depends on what happens on that phone call, right? Yeah. Or if you know somebody always calls you the same time every day, you just don't happen to have your phone with you. Yeah, exactly. Oh man, I don't know where my phone was when you called, right? Last signal, exactly. I'm going through it. No, man, that call dropped so bad. I'm sorry. Those are all really escape maintain behaviors. Avoidance is when you engage in a response so that you don't feel the punishing event. So escape is that the punishing event is occurring and I'm going to leave it. And avoidance is when I engage in a behavior so that I never have to feel the punishing effects, right? So I'm going to put my seatbelt on before it beeps at me. That is avoidance. If I wait until it starts beeping at me and I do it, that's escape. You're making the bed. Jazz example would be avoidance. Which just seems weird because you're, making your bed, but you're making your bed to avoid feeling anxious about having a dirty house. Easy. All right. So positive reinforcement. So absence of food for 2 hours. Teacher says snack time. And apples are on the table. So child says apple, please. Apple is presented. They're more likely to ask for apples next time they're hungry. And apples are present. Negative reinforcement would be a math worksheet with 20 problems on your desk. Teacher says complete 5 problems, then you don't have to do the rest. You complete the 5 problems and you don't have to do the last problems. So now completing problems when you're instructed to do so are more likely to occur in the future. Or I could say, what's a common thing teachers want you to do in class? Sit quietly. If you sit quietly, then I'll give you a homework pass and you don't have to do your homework. Right. Parents can give you like getting out of having to do a chore at home would be a good example. All right, so these are similar because these are both involving an increase in behavior, but for different reasons, because these are different. Okay. So here's another example. So we have wet hands from washing our hands in the bathroom. And so then we dry our hands on the paper towel, and now our hands are dry and water is gone from our hands, right? So that would be negative reinforcement. Right. Same thing for using windshield wipers. There's water on the windscreen. You turn on your windshield wipers, the water is gone. Now you can see better. So negative reinforcement. In the future, when it's raining, you're more likely to turn your windshield wipers on. Right? All right, one more. Carrots on Timmy's plate. He screams. Carrots are taken away. Now he doesn't have to eat the carrots. He wins. Goal is to not let Timmy win. No, I'm just kidding. I would just want Timmy to say, I'm full, or engage in a more socially appropriate behavior than screaming if we're going to take our carrots away. Or maybe like take 1 bite and then I'll take the rest of the carrots away. Right. So kind of like that teacher with the math problems. You do 5 and then you don't have to do the rest of the worksheet. I just need you to attempt the first few. So that's kind of where you start here. Okay. All right. One more. Morning alarm noise. You press the stop button too many times and the alarm noise stops. So turning off your alarm in the morning is an example of negative reinforcement, even though we all hate it and it really feels punishing. It's like 14 steps. There we go. All right. So now that we've talked about positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, we're going to talk about schedules of reinforcement. Based on your reading, why would you think that the schedule for reinforcement would matter? Let's backtrack. What do I mean by schedule of reinforcement? Yeah, When the reinforcement occurs, you guys just said it at the same time. That's good. So when the reinforcement occurs. So why would that matter? For this or that. Yeah, and this is somewhat about the timing of after the behavior, but rather about after how many occurrences of that behavior am I going to reinforce? So which instances of this behavior am I going to reinforce? So why would that matter?
Till a child behavior after we stop intervention. It's about increasing longevity.
Yeah, so if I reinforce the behavior every time, 100% of the time, and all of a sudden I stop, that's going to be way more noticeable. And you're going to have a much more immediate decrease in behavior than if I randomly, intermittently provide reinforcement so that you don't know necessarily exactly when it's going to occur. Okay. So there's this like gradient here. So continuous reinforcement is essentially 100% reinforcement across the board. Every time this behavior happens, we are giving reinforcement. Somewhere in between these arrow points, we would call these intermittent schedules of reinforcement, and there are different types of intermittent schedules of reinforcement, which we'll talk about more in a second. And then extinction occurs when we stop reinforcing that behavior completely. So it's not even about punishment. This is just about, I'm no longer going to reinforce you for doing this behavior. Okay. All right. So we have fixed ratios and variable ratios. A fixed ratio essentially occurs when we give it after an exact number, a fixed number of responses. So it can be fixed ratio of 1. So like I do it after every occurrence, or a fixed ratio of 2, 3, or 4. So after every second time you do it, I'm going to reward. Every third time you do it, I'm going to reward. Every fourth time you do it, I'm going to reward. Whatever it is. But this happens on a very fixed schedule, right? So what hypothesis might you make if you were doing that in terms of like behavior, rates of behavior? How quickly is that behavior going to increase? So fixed ratio of 1 would be continuous. So that is continuous reinforcement. So fixed ratio of 1 is continuous reinforcement. And that would have a very steady increase, right? Like if I want to teach up a skill fast, I want to reinforce it every time for a while. But very quickly, once that skill is learned, I want to fade and provide more intermittent reinforcement. So if I'm on an intermittent reinforcement schedule of like 5, what do you think is going to happen right after we get reinforcement for that 5th occurrence? There's going to be a pause. Yeah. So there's going to be a pause because I got reinforcement and I know that I'm not going to get it again until I do that behavior 5 more times. Can you guys think of some fixed ratio schedules?
And that's what I talked to my mom. I have my nephew. He was playing basketball, like the grandma, and like at first when he was shooting, he was making. I was like, "Oh, great, great, great!" And then after a while, like he would make it, and I didn't say anything. And like he would pause and be like, "Hey, I say something?" And I'm like, "Keep going, keep going." So then after a while, I'm like, "Yay!" Then I would pause. So I've done it before,
and you didn't realize what you were doing. Yeah, so that's a good example. How about real life, everyday examples of fixed ratio reinforcement? Something that almost every time you do it, you will be rewarded. No, because I don't get a paycheck until later. Depends on what kind of job maybe if you're like serving tables and you get your tips immediately, but for most people, No, you're true. Yeah, it is. It's not a continuous one, but yes,
But yeah,
it is fixed because typically you know when it's going to happen, unless somebody screws up payroll, but that's a whole different story, right? Or if you're in the military and you go on, what's it called when they stop paying you guys? No. Well, when they can't agree on a budget and is continuous resolution. Okay. So when you guys are not getting paid, so then it's not a fixed, right? So I like to use that argument. One time I made that argument when we were active in a continuous resolution and I had somebody in the National Guard in my class and they were like, I'm not getting paid right now though. And you're like, it's true, but you have to go to work. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You gotta love the federal government. But what is something all of you did, likely all of you did to get here today? Correct. So you put the key in the ignition or you have a remote-less key start and you put your key in the car and you turned your car on and it started, right? That is like, hopefully, right. But that is generally speaking, if your car is in working condition, that is a continuous reinforcement schedule. So the second it doesn't start, we're like, oh crap, right? But that is the most daily thing, right? Beetlejuice, and then he appears, right? You have to say his name 3 times. That is a fixed ratio schedule. That's our Halloween theme. But driving a car is the one that happens for real to most of us. So with the continuous schedule of reinforcement, the teacher asks a question, the child answers correctly, the teacher's like, good job, right? So all of that every time. So that is a continuous schedule of reinforcement. We can also call that a fixed ratio of 1. A fixed ratio of 2 would look something like this. Ask the question, answers correctly. Teacher's just like, ask the question, answers correctly. Great job answering that question, right? So it happens every time, but it's still predictable. So that child's still going to answer that question the second time because in order to get reinforced, or the first time, because in order to get reinforcement, we have to ask and answer a question twice. So we're still going to do it. So it doesn't decrease the likelihood of that other behavior. So what you'll find is that there's a slow pause, right? So we go here, reinforcement's delivered here, and then we have a pause, and then we do the behavior, right? And then reinforcement's through there. So there's going to be a slight pause after you give reinforcement when you are on a fixed schedule. And then if reinforcement stops at any point, responding quickly stops. And then, sorry guys, I'm feeling really off right now. So I don't know, hot flash or something. So bear with me. I don't know. I'm feeling a little dizzy. So, all right. Just wanted to share that if I sound off here for a second. So I'm going to try to pull this together. But reinforcement is delivered on a variable ratio after a variable or an average number of responses. So it's not a set number of responses. So like an average of every 5 responses. So that might mean 3 times and then 7 times and then 5 times. And then that averages out to 5. Sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 2, but it always averages out to 5. So what would happen here? What do you think would happen here? Yeah, you would see less frequent pauses, right? Why? Because they never know when it's coming. So you're always going to engage in higher rates of behavior. Can you think of any real life examples? Yeah, you're going to engage in higher rates of behavior. That this is the time that they'll get the reward. Mm-hmm. A little bit, yeah. All right, can you think of any real life examples? slot machine, casino. You never know when it's going to come. But you're always going to do it because the payout might be really big. All right. So here's a visual of that, right? So we ask a question, answer correctly, we reward. Ask a question a couple of times, no reward. Ask a question, answer correctly, reward on that fourth time, so on and so forth. So you see that it changes. Sometimes you're going to get rewarded back to back for behavior. Sometimes there's long gaps. Yeah, because it's all about timing. Yeah. And that stresses some people out. Makes you, yeah. So what we find with a variable ratio is a much steadier rate. So no pause in responding right after reinforcement is received. All right, so considerations when we have a ratio schedule. So what will happen is if the number of required responses is too great for the reinforcement provided. So like, think about if you had to wait too long for your paycheck, you would be less likely to work for that paycheck, right? So you're going to work better if you have a weekly paycheck or a bi-weekly paycheck than if you're paid monthly or quarterly or something like that. And so we want to make sure, right? So I said count to 5 and I'll give you $5, you would probably do it, right? But if I said count to 1 billion, and then once you hit 1 billion, I'll give you $5. So you have to say 1 billion numbers before you're reinforced. That string's too high. But if I was like count to 1 billion and I'll give you $1 billion, you might try it, right? Yeah. Caitlin's like, absolutely, yes. Yes. Yeah. Right. Is counting to 1 billion easy though? Because how long would that take you? Yeah. Can I end it, go to sleep, wake up the next day, and how many days would it take you to count? Yeah. Yes, you could get water. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So those are ratios. So it's about the number of times you engage in the behavior that gets you the reward. Yeah.
And just remember, you do have to spell out what the continuum is before we get to the
It depends on what level the behavior is already at when you start intervention. If it is a brand new skill that you've never like seen before, then you want to do it for a while and get pretty consistent responding. And then you want to quickly fade off of that fixed ratio of 1. If it's a skill they're already doing intermittently, then I don't necessarily need to like reward it every time when I start my intervention. All right, which then brings us from ratio to interval schedules. So an interval schedule is different in that it is about the amount of time that occurs from between responses or between intervention or between reinforcement being done. So like for a fixed interval of 1 minute, every time you wait a minute, and then that first time they engage in the behavior that you're looking for, you reinforce. Okay, but the time limit has to elapse first. So the beauty of this is that it makes it even less predictable as to when you're going to get reinforcement to an extent. So there's this time component, but it might take you 3 minutes before you actually do it, right? So if I was like, every time the child like claps their hands, and after a minute, since the last time I gave reinforcement, the minute ends, and then it takes an additional 30 seconds before they clap. So, but that's the first instance after the interval ended, and so now I'm going to reward it. So it's still less obvious as to when reinforcement is going to occur. So can you think of real life examples that are on fixed interval schedules? When you're rewarded immediately after a certain amount of time. It's probably on an interval, but I don't know if they are. They probably do change based on like traffic, right? Time of day. I would hope that they change based on traffic. Plus, some of them are motion sensors, so when they, like when somebody comes the opposite direction. Yeah, so it's probably not a fixed interval. Well, yeah, just cooking in general, right? Setting a timer, yeah. And then as soon as the timer goes off, your food's ready. And it's a fixed interval because you set the timer. You know exactly how much time. Other ones which are less likely to occur in Memphis, but public transit. All right, so it'll tell you like, this bus gets here every 10 minutes-ish. So 10 minutes pass, and then the first bus that stops after that 10-minute marker, right, you get on it. Reinforcement's now available. So when we're thinking about with fixed ratio, right, there's like a plateau and it's like a stair step. And with fixed, with variable ratio is a pretty steep incline in behavior. How do you think behavior responding is going to look if I were to graph it on this? Yeah, how so? Predictable. After reinforcement occurs, what are you going to do? You're going to pause. And then as you get closer to the end of the interval, what are you going to do? Because remember, you don't know exactly, you're not like checking it constantly, right? Your behavior is going to increase. So have you ever you're like putting cookies in the oven and the timer's still going, but you're like, gosh, how much time's left on my timer? I can smell the cookies. It smells like they're almost done. I'm going to check the oven, right? I'm going to keep checking to make sure that I don't overcook or burn my cookies, even though I've already set a timer that's going to let me know. But so what's going to happen is when I first put them in and I set the timer, I'm going to walk away and I'm not going to worry about it for quite some time, right? Until we get closer to the end of that 10 to 12 minute interval. And then I'm going to come peek and check on it. And then I'm going to check on it some more. And I'm going to keep checking on it so I don't forget that they're in there. And so that's the scalloped responding that you see here. All right. So when we're initially trying to start a behavior, a fixed ratio is helpful because it's going to have a higher increase faster. So what's going to happen here is we're going to just have this moderate rate of responding. So we do it and then we wait a while and then we do it again. And then we wait a while and we do it again. So it can be helpful, but we can also find problems here where, especially if I need you to engage in this behavior pretty consistently, that might be problematic, right? If there are times where you're not going to engage in the behavior at all. No. And then if reinforcement stops, the only benefit here is if reinforcement stops, it's going to take you a pretty quick time to recognize it because it was coming at a set time. So like every 1 minute, every 2 minutes, I know reinforcement's occurring. It's been 2 minutes, reinforcement hasn't occurred. Now it's been 5 minutes and reinforcement still hasn't occurred. Well, it's probably never coming, right? Right. So you will be quick to stop doing the behavior at all once that happens. And that happens with either type of fixed schedule, fixed ratio and fixed interval. When reinforcement stops, because it is very predictable as to when it's coming, as soon as reinforcement no longer occurs, my behavior will go on extinction much faster. All right. Another part of the fixed interval is this thing called a limited hold. So essentially, it's like a contingency that you add at the end of the schedule of reinforcement to increase adherence to the schedule. So it says, like, essentially, you have to engage in this behavior within 30 seconds after that interval ends for you to get reinforcement. If it occurs after that 30 seconds, then even if you do it, you're not going to get reinforcement until the next interval is over. Does that make sense? Okay. So what happens if it's a minute interval and the interval has ended, you'll have 30 seconds to engage in the behavior. If you haven't engaged in the behavior within that 30 seconds, then your opportunity for reinforcement is gone and the interval restarts. And then you have to wait a minute, and then you have 30 seconds to engage in that behavior. So even if you immediately engage in it, but it's like 31 seconds, then you're not going to get reinforced. And if we're thinking about cooking, right, you have a set amount of time to get to that oven if the temperature is still running and on. Otherwise, you're going to burn your food, and then it's not going to be edible, and then you're not going to get reinforced. That with that limited hold, right, it would be different from item to item that you have in the oven. Some things burn faster than others. Yeah, to get rewarded. And then once that window of opportunity is closed, you would have to start the interval over again in order to be able to access reinforcement. All right. Any other questions here? All right, so then we have a variable interval schedule. So this is when reinforcement is delivered after the first response following an average amount of time. Okay, so a variable interval of 1 minute would be, sometimes it's 30 seconds, sometimes it's 90 seconds, sometimes it's a minute, sometimes it's 45 seconds, but on across the board, it's about an average of 1 minute, and then you get rewarded. But as that increases, our behavior strengthens. So like, it makes it much more resistant to removal of reinforcement. So our behavior is going to stay consistent longer over time if we have like a variable interval of 10 minutes, obviously versus 1 minute, because you just don't know when it's going to happen and you don't know when it stopped coming. So a good example of this is like fishing, right? You don't know when you're going to catch a fish. For some weird reason, people still fish. I find it super boring, but that's just me. Some people find it peaceful and calming. But you never know, you really never know when that fish is going to get on your hook, right? But you're going to keep doing it. Yes, the fish is behind him, right? So we have a nice, slow to moderate, steady rate of responding. We have very little like pause after reinforcement. And if reinforcement stops, responding is not quick to cease. So when we put all these graphs together on one thing, you can see that that variable ratio gives us really fast rates of responding. And then fixed ratio is the next fastest, but there's this weird pause thing that happens that maybe isn't great. The variable interval looks pretty similar to that variable ratio, but slower and steadier rate of picking up a skill. And then the fixed interval has that weird scallop thing. So again, maybe isn't great long-term. So if I was doing an intervention, what type of ratio would I start with? Or what type of schedule of reinforcement would I start with? Variable ratio. Maybe, but fixed ratio is my continuous. So I'm probably going to start there until I get it. And then I'm going to quickly switch to this variable. Okay. And then what's the next one I should go to? The variable interval. Yeah, if possible. If that's, sometimes the issue with variable interval is that it's difficult to administer as somebody providing the intervention. So like parents and teachers struggle more with that, because if I'm like, do it whenever you feel like it, then they oftentimes forget to do it. So sometimes having a concrete, like do it every 5 minutes, they're much more likely to follow through with it.
It has to happen a certain period of time, each time, but it's different times within that time. Like it happens every 5 minutes, but different times within that 5 minutes. Is that why?
Okay, the interval. Okay, so no, with the variable interval, it's an average of 5 minutes. So sometimes you get it after 2 minutes, sometimes you get it after 4 minutes, sometimes you get it after 6 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes, and then it averages out to about 5 minutes. Right. But the interval has to end before you're able to get reinforcement. So even if you engage in the behavior during the interval, it's not going to get you reinforcement. You have to engage in the behavior after that interval is over. Like right after that interval is over. So that's kind of the part there that keeps it going, if you will. So they'll try in the middle of the interval because unless you have your stopwatch, you don't know how many minutes it's been. And if you don't know, because it's just an average of 5 minutes, you don't know if this interval is the 2-minute interval or not. So you're going to try at 2 minutes. Go ahead. No, for most skill development, I'm going to start with fixed ratio, move quickly to variable ratio, and then quickly end on variable interval. This variable interval is real life. We don't always quantify that in real life as, that's an average of this many minutes, right? But that's real life, right? You don't necessarily know when you're going to get rewarded for speeding or punished for speeding. It just happens randomly. Typically, that's the least likely. It depends on the skill. Most of the times when you're using a fixed interval, we do it more when we're trying to decrease a behavior through extinction. So it's as long as they don't engage in problem behavior for this fixed interval of time, then I'll provide reinforcement. So it's more about a lack of behavior in a fixed ratio or fixed interval. But we'll talk more about that when we talk about how else do you get rid of behavior besides punishment, because punishment is not the only way to decrease behavior. Removal of reinforcement is. All right. Any other questions about schedules of reinforcement?